After 50 years, a man reunites with his first love in a nursing home, but a surprising secret is revealed. Something so shocking his life will never be the same. Richard Martinez entered the reception hall of Sunflower Haven Retirement Community, his steps measured and deliberate. At 75, he carried a lifetime of stories etched into his soul, but also a profound emptiness left by the death of Eleanor, his wife of over 5 decades. Though his son Roland had convinced him to move closer, "It'll be good for you, Dad, and for us too," Roland had insisted. The weight of leaving the home he had shared with Eleanor was nearly unbearable. The reception area was a hive of activity, with staff bustling about and residents engaged in quiet conversations. Richard paused, feeling momentarily overwhelmed. "Mr. Martinez?" The voice belonged to Jessica Morris, a young nurse with an easy smile and a calm presence that seemed to cut through the noise. She approached him with a clipboard tucked under her arm. "Yes, that's me," he replied, straightening slightly, though his hands gripped the handle of his suitcase just a little tighter. "Welcome to Sunflower Haven," she said warmly. "Let me take you to your room. It's ready for you, and I think you'll find it quite comfortable." Richard followed her through the hallways, his cane tapping softly against the tiled floor. Jessica slowed her pace to match his, offering light conversation as they walked. "Have you lived in Florida long, Mr. Martinez?" "Only just moved here," he said tersely, not in the mood for small talk. Jessica nodded, undeterred. "Well, I think you'll like it here. We have a lot of activities and a wonderful community." Richard grunted in response, his thoughts elsewhere. When they arrived at his room, Jessica opened the door and gestured for him to enter. "Here we are. If you need anything at all, just let me or any of the staff know. We're here to help." Richard nodded, stepping inside. The room was neat and functional, with neutral tones and a large window overlooking the garden. He placed his suitcase on the bed, his movements slow and deliberate. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "I think I just need some time to settle in." "Of course. Take all the time you need," Jessica replied kindly before leaving him alone. Left to himself, Richard unpacked in silence. Each item he pulled from his suitcase felt like a relic of a life he had left behind. His hands paused as he retrieved a framed photograph of Eleanor, their wedding day captured in timeless black and white. He stared at her smiling face, the ache of loss tightening his chest. Gently, he placed the photo on the nightstand, brushing his fingers against the glass. "Eleanor," he murmured, "I hope I'm doing the right thing." That night, sleep came fitfully. Memories of the life he and Eleanor had built together haunted him. Her laughter, the way she had always known how to calm his restless heart. In the quiet darkness, the unfamiliar room felt colder than he expected. The next morning, Richard decided to explore the grounds. He needed a distraction, a reason to step outside the weight of his thoughts. Taking his cane, he made his way to the garden, finding himself drawn to its paths and quiet corners. The scent of flowers was faint in the air, and the sound of a distant fountain offered a sense of calm he hadn't realized he needed. He found a bench tucked beneath the shade of a large tree and sat down, letting his gaze wander. He wasn't ready to join the clusters of residents chatting near the fountain. Solitude felt safer, less complicated. His mind drifted as he stared at the flowers, his thoughts a tangle of grief and uncertainty. Then, a soft voice broke through his reverie. "Richard?" Startled, he turned his head, his brow furrowing as he looked at the woman standing a few feet away. Her silver hair framed a face that was both aged and achingly familiar, and her eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were unmistakable. "Margaret," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of the name. She smiled, a mixture of nostalgia and hesitation in her expression. "Yes, it's me." For a moment, neither of them moved, the years melting away as they stared at each other. Memories of summer nights by the lake, of laughter and whispered promises, rushed back to Richard in an overwhelming wave. "I can't believe it," he finally managed. "After all these years, you're here." Margaret stepped closer, her own emotions clearly fighting for control. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me." "Remember you?" Richard's voice softened, a faint smile forming. "How could I ever forget?" They sat together on the bench, the awkwardness of the years apart fading as they began to talk. The conversation meandered through shared memories of their youth in Ohio, days spent by the water, dreams they once shared, and the innocence of first love. "Do you ever think about those days?" Margaret asked, her voice tinged with wistfulness. "All the time," Richard admitted. "They were some of the best days of my life." Her gaze dropped to her hands. "For me too." The morning stretched into afternoon as they talked, their connection rekindling with surprising ease. But as the conversation deepened, Richard noticed a flicker of something in Margaret's expression, an unspoken weight that lingered behind her smile. For now, he didn't press her. There would be time for questions later. At that moment, it was enough to simply be in her company again, to feel a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. As they rose to part ways, Margaret touched his arm lightly. "I'm glad we found each other again, Richard." "So am I," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Neither of them could have predicted how much their lives were about to change. In the days that followed their unexpected reunion, Richard and Margaret became inseparable. They shared breakfast in the dining hall, strolled through the gardens, and often found themselves lingering on benches, lost in conversation. The years apart seemed to fade as they revisited the stories of their youth. "You were always the best swimmer," Margaret remarked one afternoon, her voice light with nostalgia. Richard chuckled. "Only because you hated getting your hair wet. You gave me a clear advantage." She laughed, shaking her head. "It wasn't just that. You had this natural grace in the water. Everyone admired it." "Everyone except your father," Richard said, his tone turning wistful. Margaret's smile faltered for a moment, and Richard noticed the subtle shift in her expression. A shadow seemed to cross her face, and though she quickly masked it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper lingered beneath her cheerful exterior. Their days were filled with laughter, but Richard couldn't ignore the moments when Margaret grew quiet, her gaze distant. She often seemed on the verge of saying something, but then stopped herself, retreating into silence. One evening after dinner, they decided to take a walk through the garden. The pathways were softly lit, creating an intimate atmosphere. Richard felt a growing sense of urgency to confront the questions that had been building inside him. As they reached a quiet corner near the fountain, he stopped. "Margaret," he said, turning to face her, his voice steady but gentle, "I can't shake the feeling that there's something you're not telling me." She stiffened slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. "Richard, why would you think that?" "It's the way you look at me sometimes," he said, searching her face. "Like there's something you want to say but can't. I don't want to push, but if there's something weighing on you, I hope you know you can trust me." Margaret's gaze dropped to the ground, and she took a deep breath. When she finally looked up, her blue eyes glistened with unshed tears. "There are things about my past that I've never shared with anyone, things I've carried alone for a long time." Richard stepped closer, his voice softening. "You don't have to carry them alone anymore. Whatever it is, I'm here. You've always been able to trust me." Her lip trembled as she nodded. "You're right, I owe you the truth." She hesitated, gathering her courage, and then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Richard, I had a son. His name is Daniel." For a moment, Richard was too stunned to respond. "A son?" he finally said, his voice filled with surprise and curiosity. "Margaret, that's incredible. Do you see him often?" She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "No, I don't. I never have." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Her hands trembled as she wiped her tears away. "I gave him up for adoption when he was born. I never got to hold him, never got to see him grow up." The weight of her words settled over Richard, and he felt a pang of sadness for her. "Why? Why would you do that? What happened?" Margaret hesitated, her shame evident. "Because I didn't have a choice. And because Because he's your son too, Richard. Her confession hit him like a wave, leaving him momentarily speechless. He stepped back, his mind reeling. My son? She nodded, her voice breaking. Yes, your son. I found out I was pregnant after you left for the Navy. My father, he forbid me from contacting you. He said you'd moved on, that it was better for everyone if I went away. He sent me to stay with relatives in another state until the baby was born. Afterward, I didn't have a say in what happened. Richard's jaw tightened as a flood of emotions surged through him, anger, sadness, disbelief. Margaret, I wrote to you. I sent so many letters. I waited for you. Her tears fell freely now. I never got them. My father intercepted everything. He made sure we couldn't find each other. He controlled every part of my life back then. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how. And after I gave Daniel up, I thought you'd never forgive me. Ease. Richard turned away, pacing as he tried to process the enormity of what she had just revealed. He robbed us, he said, his voice low and filled with pain. Your father stole everything from us, our chance at a life together, our chance to be a family. I know, Margaret whispered, her voice trembling, and I've lived with that guilt every day. I'm so sorry, Richard. I was young and scared, and I didn't know how to fight back. He stopped and faced her, his expression softening as he saw the anguish in her eyes. Slowly, he reached out and took her hands in his. It wasn't your fault. You were just a kid, and you were trapped. But Margaret, we have a son out there, and we need to find him. Her eyes widened, hope mingling with fear. Do you mean that? Absolutely, he said firmly. We've lost so much time already. I don't want to lose any more. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could right the wrongs of the past. Richard sat in stunned silence, Margaret's words echoing in his mind. His son. Those two words carried a weight he could barely comprehend. Finally, he managed to speak, though his voice was little more than a whisper. My son. Margaret nodded, her hands trembling as they clutched at her skirt. Yes, Richard, our son. He stared at her, trying to process the revelation. His chest tightened, his breath shallow. How is this possible? How could I not know? Margaret, why didn't you tell me? Her gaze fell to her lap, her voice trembling as she began to explain. After you left for the Navy, I found out I was pregnant. I was terrified, Richard. I didn't know what to do. I tried to write to you, but before I could even send the letter, my father found out. He was furious. He said I'd brought shame to our family and that I had no future if I kept the baby. Richard's fists clenched, his anger rising with each word she spoke. So what? He just decided for you? For us? Margaret's eyes glistened with fresh tears. Yes, he sent me away to live with an aunt in another state. He said it was for my own good, that I needed to forget you and move on. And when Daniel was born, her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath. He made me give him up. I didn't even get to hold him, Richard. They took him away almost immediately. Richard's hands pressed against his temples as he tried to make sense of it all. Margaret, I wrote to you dozens of letters. I waited for you to respond, but I never heard anything. She looked up at him, her expression filled with regret and pain. I never got them. My father must have intercepted them all. He wanted to make sure we stayed apart. Richard stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the stone patio beneath them. He began pacing, his emotions a volatile mix of anger and heartbreak. He had no right, Richard said, his voice sharp. He stole everything from us. From me, from our son. How could he justify that? How could he live with himself? I've asked myself those same questions every day for the past 50 years, Margaret replied, her voice soft but steady. I hated him for it, Richard. But I was young and he was so powerful. I didn't know how to stand up to him. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression raw. And Daniel, what happened to him? Where is he now? Margaret shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know. I was told he was adopted by a family who could give him a better life. After that, I was cut off from any information. I don't even know if he knows who we are." Richard's chest ached with the weight of her words. The thought of a son he had never known, out there in the world, was almost too much to bear. He lowered himself back into his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "We need to find him," he said finally, his voice resolute. "We need to find our son, Margaret." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Do you really mean that?" "Of course I do," he said, leaning forward. "I've already lost decades with him. I refuse to lose any more. If there's even a chance we can find him, we have to try. But what if—" She hesitated, her voice trembling with doubt. "Or what if he doesn't want to know us? What if we're just a painful reminder of the past he's tried to forget?" Richard reached across the table and took her hand firmly in his. "We won't know unless we try. Margaret, this is our chance to make things right. For him, for us." Her gaze searched his, and after a long moment she nodded. "You're right. We owe it to him to try, even if it's just to let him know the truth." Richard squeezed her hand. "Then we'll do it. We'll find him." Their determination solidified. They began discussing how to start the search. Margaret admitted that she had little to go on, only the name she had chosen for him, Daniel, and the adoption papers her father had forced her to sign. "We'll need help," Richard said thoughtfully. "Someone who knows how to navigate this kind of thing." Margaret nodded, wiping her tears. "There's a woman here at the community, Linda Parker. She used to work as a social worker. Maybe she can point us in the right direction. Let's talk to her first thing tomorrow," Richard said. For the first time since their conversation had begun, Margaret managed a faint smile. "Thank you, Richard, for not blaming me, for being willing to do this." He looked at her, his expression softening. "There's nothing to forgive, Margaret. None of this was your fault. We were both victims of your father's cruelty, but now we have a chance to take back some of what we lost." Margaret's smile grew, though it was tinged with sadness. "I just hope it's not too late." Richard's voice was steady as he replied, "It's never too late." The next morning, Margaret and Richard met Linda Parker, the activities coordinator at Sunflower Haven, in her small, tidy office. Linda was known for her no-nonsense demeanor, but her warmth shone through in her genuine care for the residents. She greeted them with a friendly smile, gesturing for them to sit. "What can I help you with?" Linda asked, folding her hands on her desk. Margaret glanced at Richard, then back at Linda, her voice trembling as she began. "Linda, this might sound unusual, but we need help finding someone. My son, our son." Linda's brows furrowed slightly as she leaned forward. "Your son? I didn't know—" "It's a long story," Richard interjected gently, his tone calm but determined. "Margaret and I were separated years ago and, well, there were circumstances neither of us could control. We only recently found out that we have a son together. His name is Daniel, and Margaret was forced to give him up for adoption." Linda's eyes softened with understanding. "That's a lot to process. I can see why this is so important to you." "It is," Margaret said, her hands ringing nervously in her lap. "I've thought about him every day of my life. We need to find him, Linda. We need to know if he's okay." Linda nodded thoughtfully. "I used to work as a social worker before I came here. I might still have some contacts who can help. Do you have any information about the adoption? A name? A date? Anything?" Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a faded envelope containing the few details she had. "This is all I have. It's from the agency my father arranged. I don't know if they're still in operation." Linda examined the papers carefully, her lips pursed in concentration. "This is a start. The agency might have records, though adoptions from that time were often closed, meaning they didn't disclose information to the biological parents. But laws have changed since then, and there might be a way to access the records." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's possible?" Linda looked at her firmly. "I think it's worth trying. Give me a day or two to make some calls. If there's anything to be found, I'll find it." Richard reached over and placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's. "Thank you, Linda. We can't tell you how much this means to us." "I'll do my best," Linda said with a smile. As they left Linda's office, Margaret exhaled shakily. "Do you think she'll find anything?" Richard squeezed her hand. "If anyone can, it's Linda. We have to trust her." The next few days felt like an eternity. Margaret and Richard spent hours walking through the gardens, sitting by the fountain, and talking late into the evening. The more they shared, the more they realized how much they had missed in each other's lives. Richard spoke often of Eleanor, his wife of 50 years. "She was the kindest person I've ever known," he told Margaret one evening as they sat beneath a tree. "She had this way of making you feel like everything was going to be okay, no matter how bad things seemed." Margaret smiled softly. "She must have been extraordinary. You were lucky to have her." "I was," Richard admitted, "but that doesn't mean I didn't think of you, Margaret. There were times, especially when things were quiet, when I'd wonder where you were, what your life had become. I never forgot you." Margaret looked down at her hands. "I never forgot you either, Richard. Even during the happiest moments of my life, there was always a part of me that felt incomplete." She began sharing stories of her own life, a career as a teacher, the joy she found in mentoring young minds, but also the deep loneliness that had persisted despite her accomplishments. "Every year on his birthday, I'd sit alone and wonder what he looked like, what kind of man he'd grown into," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd pray that he was happy, that he had a good family." Richard took her hand, his voice firm. "We're going to find him, Margaret. We owe it to him and to ourselves." On the third afternoon, Linda approached them in the garden, an envelope clutched in her hand. Her expression was calm but laced with excitement. "I think I found something," she said, her voice steady. Margaret stood quickly, her breath catching in her throat. "What? What did you find?" Linda handed her the envelope. "His name is Daniel Evans. He's 50 years old and lives in Atlanta. He's an architect." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a small stack of documents, including a photo of a tall man with salt and pepper hair, sharp features, and piercing eyes. Margaret gasped, her fingers brushing over the image. He looks so much like you, Richard. Look at his eyes." Richard took the photo, his breath hitching as he studied it. The resemblance was undeniable. "That's him," he murmured. "That's our son." Margaret's tears began to fall as she clutched the photo to her chest. "We found him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "After all these years, we finally found him." Linda smiled gently. "There's an address included, along with a phone number. It's up to you how you want to proceed, but I'm here to help with whatever you decide." Richard placed a steadying hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We'll need to think about the best way to approach him. This is a lot for anyone to take in." Margaret nodded, though her eyes never left the photo. I can't believe this is real. I've dreamed of this moment for so long, but now that it's here, I don't know what to do." Richard pulled her into a comforting embrace. "We'll figure it out together, one step at a time." Days passed in a fog of uncertainty as Margaret and Richard debated the best way to reach out to Daniel. The weight of the moment loomed over them, every possibility examined and re-examined in their long conversations. Margaret's fear of rejection was palpable, but Richard's steady resolve carried them both forward. "We need to tell him the truth," Richard insisted one evening as they sat in her room, the envelope from Linda resting between them. "If we try to sugarcoat it or hold anything back, he'll know. We owe him honesty." Margaret nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a piece of stationery. "You're right. But how do you start a letter like this? Hello, we're your biological parents who've been searching for you after 50 years. Richard placed a comforting hand on hers. "We'll start with the truth. That's all we have." Together, they drafted the letter, each word carefully chosen to explain the circumstances without overwhelming him. Margaret's hand shook as she signed her name at the bottom, and Richard added his signature beside hers. When they sealed the envelope and mailed it the next morning, a strange mix of hope and dread settled over them. Every passing day without a response stretched their nerves thin. "I keep imagining what he must be thinking," Margaret confided to Richard during one of their garden walks. "Does he hate us? Is he confused? Or maybe he's just indifferent?" Richard stopped and turned to her. "Margaret, we can't control how he feels. All we can do is give him the chance to decide. That's more than either of us had back then." She nodded, but her worry didn't ease. A week later, as they sat at breakfast, Jessica approached them with urgency in her step. "Margaret," she said, her voice kind but direct, "there's a phone call for you at the front desk. It's Daniel Evans." Margaret froze, her fork slipping from her hand. Her face turned pale, and she looked at Richard with wide eyes. "It's him," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He's calling." Richard rose immediately, offering her his arm. "Come on, I'll be with you." With his steadying presence, Margaret walked to the front desk, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. Jessica handed her the phone, and she gripped it tightly, pressing it to her ear. "Hello?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Is this Margaret Evans?" asked a deep, unfamiliar voice on the other end. "Yes," she said, her throat tightening. "Yes, it's me." "Dees." There was a pause before the man spoke again. "This is Daniel. I got your letter." Margaret's breath caught, and her free hand clutched Richard's arm for support. "Thank you for calling," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't imagine what you must be feeling right now." "It's a lot to process," Daniel admitted. His tone was calm but cautious. "But I've always wondered about my biological parents. When I got your letter, I knew I needed to know more." Margaret's tears began to fall, her voice thick with emotion. "I've dreamed of this day for so long, Daniel. Thank you for giving us this chance." "I want to meet," Daniel said after a moment. "There's a lot I need to understand, and I think it's better to talk in person." "Yes, of course," Margaret said quickly. "Whenever and wherever you'd like." They arranged to meet the following week at a quiet coffee in Atlanta. When the call ended, Margaret leaned heavily against Richard, tears streaming down her face. "He wants to meet us," she said, her voice breaking with a mixture of relief and fear. Richard embraced her tightly. "That's a good sign, Margaret. He's curious. He's open to hearing us out." "I hope I don't say the wrong thing," she whispered. "I'm so scared, Richard." "You'll do fine," he reassured her. "We both will. We've waited 50 years for this moment. We'll face it together." The day of the meeting arrived, and Margaret and Richard made the drive to Atlanta, their nerves growing with each passing mile. Margaret clutched the photo of Daniel in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of his face. "He looks so much like you," she said for the 100th time. "It's uncanny." Richard smiled faintly. "I just hope he's ready to meet us. That's all that matters." At the coffee, they chose a table near the back, away from the bustling crowd. Margaret fidgeted with her napkin, her hands trembling. "Margaret," Richard said gently, reaching for her hand. "Breathe. He's coming because he wants to meet us. That's a good thing." She nodded, her eyes darting to the door every time it opened. Finally, Daniel walked in. He was tall and well-built, his salt and pepper hair lending him an air of quiet dignity. His eyes, so much like Richard's, scanned the room until they landed on the pair, sitting nervously at the table. "Daniel," Margaret called, standing up, her voice wavering. He approached them slowly, his expression cautious but not unfriendly. "Yes," he said, stopping in front of her. "It's me." Margaret couldn't hold back her tears as she stepped closer and embraced him. "Oh, Daniel," she said, her voice breaking, "it's so good to see you." He hesitated for a moment before returning the hug, patting her back awkwardly. "It's good to meet you," he said. When they sat down, Daniel looked between the two of them, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "This is surreal," he admitted. "I've always wondered about my biological parents, but I never expected this." "We never stopped thinking about you," Richard said, his voice steady. "Not for a moment. We didn't know where you were or if you were okay, but you were always in our hearts." Margaret nodded, her tears flowing freely. "I've prayed for this day for so long, Daniel. I need you to know how much I love you." Daniel's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained measured. "I appreciate that, but I need to understand what happened. Why did you give me up?" Richard and Margaret took turns recounting the painful story of their separation, the choices forced upon them, and the years of regret and longing that followed. Daniel listened intently, his own emotions evident as his eyes grew misty. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "That's a lot to take in," he admitted, "but it explains so much. Thank you for being honest with me. Would you like to know more about us?" Richard asked carefully. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I would." As they began to share more about their lives, the ice between them began to thaw. The cautious curiosity in Daniel's eyes hinted at the possibility of a new beginning. The coffee in Atlanta was filled with the gentle hum of quiet conversations and the soft clinking of plates and glasses. But at one corner table, the weight of decades hung in the air. Margaret and Richard sat across from Daniel, each moment heavy with the unspoken emotions of their shared history. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression a careful mix of curiosity and guardedness. "So," he began, his voice steady but edged with hesitation, "I've always known I was adopted. My parents never hid that from me. They were wonderful, supportive, loving, everything you could hope for in a family." He paused, studying their faces. "But there were moments, especially as I got older, when I wondered, who were my biological parents? Why didn't they keep me? Were they alive? Did they ever think about me?" Margaret clasped her hands tightly together on the table, her knuckles white. "We thought about you every day, Daniel. Every single day. There wasn't a moment I didn't wonder where you were, if you were happy, if you were safe." Her voice cracked and she wiped at her eyes with a trembling hand. "I regret every moment I didn't fight harder for you. It's the biggest mistake of my life." Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression softening, though his tone remained measured. "Why didn't you?" Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes darting to Richard as if seeking strength. "I was young and scared. My father, he was a controlling man. When he found out I was pregnant, he sent me away and made all the decisions for me. I didn't know how to stop him." Daniel's gaze shifted to Richard. "And you? Did you know?" Richard's shoulders slumped, the pain evident in his face. "No, Daniel, I didn't know. If I had—" He stopped, his voice faltering before he continued. "If I had known, nothing in this world would have kept me from you. I didn't even know Margaret was pregnant. I wrote to her again and again, but her father intercepted every letter. I thought she had moved on." For a moment, Daniel remained silent, his eyes fixed on Richard, as if trying to measure the truth in his words. Finally, he nodded. "I believe you, but you have to understand, this is a lot for me to process. I want to understand what happened, but it's not going to be easy." Richard offered a small, encouraging smile. "Nothing worthwhile ever is." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Daniel's lips, and the tension at the table began to ease. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Tell me about you two. What were you like back then?" Margaret laughed softly, the sound tinged with nostalgia. "Richard was the town heartthrob. Everyone adored him. He had this way of making people feel like they were the most important person in the world." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't listen to her. She was the real star. Smart, kind, and completely out of my league. I still don't know how I convinced her to go out with me." Margaret's eyes sparkled with tears and affection. "You didn't have to convince me. You just had to smile." Daniel listened intently, his expression growing more relaxed as they recounted stories of their youth, the summer nights by the lake, the laughter they shared, and the dreams they once had. Slowly, the barriers between them began to crumble. The conversation shifted as Daniel started to share his own life. "I've always loved building things," he said. "When I was a kid, I used to build elaborate forts out of anything I could find. Couch cushions, boxes, sticks from the yard. My parents encouraged it, and eventually it turned into a passion for architecture." Richard's face lit up with pride. "An architect? That's impressive, Daniel. You must have a sharp mind." Daniel shrugged modestly. "It's a lot of problem solving, but I love it. My wife says I get a little too obsessed with my projects sometimes." Margaret leaned in, her voice gentle. "Your wife? Tell us about her." "Her name is Veronica," Daniel said, a warm smile spreading across his face. "She's a graphic designer. We've been married for 25 years. She's the one who keeps me grounded." "And do you have children?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's smile widened. "We do. Grace is 18 and Lucas is 14. They're amazing kids. Grace just started college and Lucas is a math whiz who wants to be an engineer." Margaret's tears returned, but this time they were tears of joy. "Grandchildren," she whispered, as if the word itself were a revelation. "We have grandchildren." Richard placed a hand over hers, his own emotions visible in the way his shoulders relaxed. "We'd love to meet them someday, if you think that's possible." Daniel hesitated, considering. "I'd like that. I think they would too. They've always known I was adopted, and they've been curious about my biological family. Meeting you, it might help them understand where they come from." Margaret reached out, placing her hand over his. "Thank you, Daniel, for giving us this chance. It means more than I can ever say." Daniel looked at her, his expression softening further. "I'm not making any promises, but I want to get to know you both. I think that's a good place to start." Richard smiled, his voice filled with gratitude. "That's all we can ask for." As the conversation wound down, the three of them began to laugh and share more freely, the initial tension giving way to a tentative sense of belonging. They weren't a perfect family, far from it, but in that small coffee in Atlanta, they were building something new. The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday at Daniel's home in a quiet Atlanta suburb. As the car pulled into the driveway, Margaret's hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. Richard placed a calming hand over hers. "Take a deep breath," he said. "This is the next step." Margaret nodded, though her nerves didn't ease. "I just hope they like us." "They will," Richard assured her. The front door opened before they reached it, and Veronica stepped out with a welcoming smile. She was a tall woman with a graceful presence and an air of calm that immediately put them at ease. "Welcome," she said warmly, extending her hand to Margaret first and then to Richard. "Daniel told us everything. It's quite the surprise, but we're happy to meet you." "Thank you for having us," Margaret replied, her voice trembling slightly. "It means so much to us." As they entered the house, Margaret and Richard exchanged quick glances. The home was bright and inviting, filled with family photos on the walls and shelves. Margaret's eyes lingered on a large framed picture of Grace and Lucas taken during a family vacation. "Speaking of the kids," Veronica said, motioning toward the living room, "they're excited to meet you." Grace was the first to approach, her confident stride and curious gaze making her seem older than her 18 years. She stopped in front of Richard, her head tilted slightly. "So, you're my grandfather?" she asked with a grin, her tone light but curious. Richard smiled broadly and crouched slightly so their eyes were level. "That's right, and you must be Grace." "That's me," she said, her grin widening. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," Richard said. Grace's smile softened. "Same here." Lucas, younger and more reserved, lingered behind Veronica, peeking out cautiously. Margaret noticed him immediately. Her years as a teacher had given her a knack for connecting with shy children. She knelt down and extended a hand toward him, her expression gentle. "Hi, Lucas," she said softly. "I'm Margaret. It's nice to meet you." Lucas hesitated, his eyes darting between her face and her outstretched hand. Finally, he stepped forward and shook her hand, offering a small smile. "Hi," he said quietly. "That's a strong handshake," Margaret said, her tone light. "I bet you're really good at building things." Lucas's eyes lit up. "Yeah, I like building stuff, especially Lego sets." "I'd love to see what you've built sometime," Margaret said, her smile encouraging. Lucas nodded, his shyness fading slightly. The initial introductions gave way to a relaxed afternoon filled with conversation. They gathered in the spacious living room, where Veronica served coffee and snacks. The family photos scattered around the room became a natural starting point. "This was our trip to Yellowstone," Veronica said, pointing to a picture of the family standing in front of a waterfall. Lucas was so fascinated by the geysers. "I wanted to know how they worked," Lucas chimed in, his confidence growing. "You must be pretty smart," Richard said, genuinely impressed. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" "An engineer," Lucas replied. "I like figuring out how things work." Richard beamed. "That's a great goal. You got a good head on your shoulders." Margaret turned her attention to Grace. "And what about you? Daniel mentioned you're in college." "Yeah, I just started at Emory," Grace said. "I'm studying biology. I want to go into medical research." "That's incredible," Margaret said, her eyes shining with pride. "Your parents must be so proud of you." Daniel, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "We are. Both of them amaze me every day." Veronica nodded. "They're good kids, and I think they're enjoying getting to know you." Margaret's voice trembled with emotion. "We're enjoying it too. I've dreamed of moments like this." Nay, as the conversation flowed, Daniel began sharing more about his childhood and his parents. "They were wonderful people," he said, "supportive, loving. They always encouraged me to pursue my dreams." Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. "I'm so glad you had that. It's what I prayed for, that you'd have a family who loved and cared for you." Richard chimed in. "They must have done a great job because you've grown into an incredible man." Daniel offered a small, appreciative smile. As the evening went on, Veronica brought out old family albums, sharing stories of vacations, birthdays, and holidays. Grace and Lucas showed Margaret and Richard their favorite hobbies. Lucas proudly displayed his most intricate Lego creations, while Grace talked about a biology project she was working on. Margaret and Richard, in turn, shared stories from their youth. They talked about the summers they spent by the lake, the mischief Richard got into as a boy, and Margaret's passion for teaching. "You were a teacher?" Lucas asked, his curiosity piqued. "For many years," Margaret said with a nod. "I loved helping kids learn and grow. I bet you would have been one of my star students." Lucas grinned. As the evening drew to a close, Grace leaned toward Richard. "So, what's it like meeting us after all this time?" Richard smiled, his voice warm. "It's a little overwhelming, but in the best way. You and your brother are everything we could have hoped for, and more." Grace's cheeks flushed, and she smiled shyly. Later that night, back at their hotel, Margaret and Richard sat quietly in their room, reflecting on the day. Margaret reached for Richard's hand, her eyes glistening with tears. "Richard," she said softly, "this was one of the happiest days of my life. Seeing them, hearing their laughter, being part of their world. It's more than I ever dared to dream." Richard squeezed her hand, his own eyes filled with emotion. "The best days are still ahead, Margaret. I can feel it." They sat together in peaceful silence, holding on to the hope that their fractured past could finally be mended. The joy of reconnecting with Daniel and his family had brought an unexpected lightness to Richard and Margaret's lives. But beneath the surface, the weight of their past remained, lingering like an unwelcome shadow. At the heart of that shadow was William Evans, Margaret's father, a name neither could utter without stirring a mix of anger, regret, and grief. One afternoon, just a week after their visit with Grace and Lucas, a courier arrived at Sunflower Haven with a thick envelope addressed to Margaret. The return address was from a law firm. Margaret hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling. Richard, sensing her unease, sat beside her, offering silent support. As she unfolded the contents, she gasped softly, "It's a letter from my father." Richard straightened, his face hardening. "Your father? What could he possibly have to say now?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She began to read, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions churning inside her. "Margaret, if you're reading this, I am no longer alive. There is no way for me to undo the pain I caused, but I owe you the truth. I destroyed the letters Richard sent you and forbade you from seeing him because I was afraid. I told myself I was protecting you, but I now know I was protecting my pride. I sent you away because I didn't want to lose control over your life. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I robbed you of choices, of love, of happiness. I have spent the last years of my life in regret. I hope one day you can forgive me, not for my sake, but for your own peace." Margaret's voice faltered as she finished, her eyes brimming with tears. He destroyed so much, but he suffered for it too. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. He had a lifetime to make things right and chose not to. A letter written after his death doesn't erase the damage he caused. Daniel, who had been sitting silently at the table, finally spoke. "I can't say I feel anything for him," he admitted. "He may have regretted it, but that doesn't change the fact that he took 50 years from us." Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hated him for what he did, but part of me always wanted to believe he thought he was doing the right thing. Maybe that's how he justified it to himself." Richard sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "It doesn't excuse anything, Margaret, but carrying around this anger, it's exhausting. For years I resented him, not even knowing the full story. Now that I do, it's just another weight to bear." Daniel folded his arms, his gaze thoughtful. "So, what do we do with this? With him? Do we just let it go?" Margaret looked at Daniel, then at Richard, her expression resolute. "We need to visit his grave." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Why? Not to forgive him," Margaret clarified, "at least not for his sake. But I need to face him, what he represents, so I can let go of the control he's had over my life. I think we all need that." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "You don't have to be," Richard said, his tone understanding. "This isn't about him anymore. It's about us, about finally letting the past stop defining our future." After a long silence, Daniel nodded reluctantly. "I'll go, if only to try to understand." 2 days later, the three of them drove to the cemetery where William Evans had been laid to rest. The car ride was mostly quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. When they arrived, Margaret hesitated at the entrance, taking a deep breath before stepping forward. The headstone was simple, bearing only William's name and the dates of his birth and death. There was no inscription, no message of love or remembrance. Margaret stood in front of it, her hands clasped tightly, while Richard and Daniel hung back slightly, giving her space. For several moments, she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the cold stone. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Dad, you took so much from me, from us. You thought you were protecting me, but all you did was leave me broken. I've spent my whole life trying to fill the gaps you created. And for what? Your pride? Your fear?" Her voice cracked and she closed her eyes, gathering herself. "I hated you for a long time. I blamed you for everything. And while I can't forget what you did, I'm choosing to let go of the anger, not for you, for me. I won't let what you did define me anymore." She turned and looked at Richard, who stepped forward, his expression resolute. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you," Richard said. "You robbed me of a family I didn't even know I had. But I refuse to let that anger consume me any longer. You don't get to have that power over me." Daniel remained silent, his arms crossed as he stared at the grave. Finally, he stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "You're just a name to me," he said, "a story of what could have been. But I'm not going to carry the weight of your choices. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I'll try." Not for you, for them. He glanced at Margaret and Richard, his expression softening. Margaret placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the headstone. "Goodbye, Dad," she said softly. As they turned to leave, there was a palpable sense of relief among them. The weight of William's choices no longer felt as heavy, and though the scars remained, the wounds had begun to heal. The cemetery was quiet as Margaret, Richard and Daniel stood before William Evans' grave. The headstone was simple, almost stark in its design, a sharp contrast to the complexity of the emotions that swirled within the three of them. Margaret held a single white flower in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she gazed at the name engraved in stone. William Evans, the man who had shaped so much of her life, not through love, but through control, decisions made without her consent, and a stubborn pride that had left deep scars. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the gravestone. She knelt slowly, her movements deliberate, and placed the flower at its base. For a moment, she stayed there, her head bowed, as if summoning the strength to face what had been left unsaid for decades. "Dad," she began, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "I've thought about this moment for so long. There were times I imagined standing here and screaming at you for everything you did to me, to us." She glanced back at Richard and Daniel, her gaze lingering on their faces before returning to the stone. "You robbed me of a life with the man I loved. You robbed me of the chance to raise my son, and you robbed Richard and Daniel of each other." Her voice cracked slightly, and she paused to gather herself. "You thought you were protecting me," she continued, her tone growing firmer. "But you weren't. You were protecting your own pride, your own sense of control. And in doing that, you broke me in ways I've spent a lifetime trying to heal." Margaret straightened slightly, her hands clasped together. "But I'm tired, Dad. I'm tired of carrying this anger. I'm tired of letting the decisions you made control me, even now that you're gone. So I'm choosing to let it go, not for you, but for me." She stepped back, her eyes wet with tears, but clear. "I forgive you," she said softly, "not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." As she turned, her gaze met Richard's, and he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to hers. "That was brave," he said, his voice low but filled with admiration. Margaret nodded, her voice steady but quiet. "It wasn't for him," she repeated. "It was for me, for us." Richard let out a deep breath as he turned his attention to the grave. For several moments, he said nothing, his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides. "When I think about the life I could have had," he began, his voice steady but sharp, "the years I could have spent with Margaret and Daniel, it makes me want to hate you. I think about the letters I wrote, the nights I spent wondering why she never wrote back, and I feel this anger, this bitterness." He paused, glancing at Margaret before continuing. "But then I think about what I have now, Margaret, Daniel, Grace and Lucas, and I know that holding on to that anger doesn't serve me anymore. It doesn't bring those years back. It doesn't change anything." Richard exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I'm not here to forgive you. I don't know if I can. But I'm done letting you live rent-free in my mind. You don't get to take up any more space in my life." He stepped back, his hand still holding Margaret's, and looked at Daniel, who stood slightly apart from them. Daniel's arms were crossed, his expression a mix of tension and thoughtfulness as he stared at the headstone. "Daniel," Margaret said softly, taking a step toward him, "you don't have to say anything if you're not ready." Daniel shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "No," he said after a moment. "I need to." He stepped closer to the grave, his movements deliberate, and stood in silence for a moment before speaking. "I don't know you," he began, his voice low but steady. "You're just a name, a story, a shadow of decisions I didn't have a say in. But those decisions shaped my entire life, who I am, where I came from, the people I thought were my family." He paused, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the right words. "I've spent the last few weeks trying to make sense of what you did. Daniel continued, his tone growing sharper. And I keep asking myself, why? Why would someone take away something so precious, so irreplaceable? What were you so afraid of? His voice softened as he glanced back at Margaret and Richard. But then I think about them, about how far we've come despite everything, and I realize that hating you doesn't change anything. It doesn't give me back the years I lost. It doesn't give them back the years they lost. Daniel's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained sad. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I'm willing to try. Not for you, but for them. For me. Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her voice filled with pride. That's all any of us can do, Daniel. Try. The three of them stood together in silence, the weight of their shared pain palpable yet somehow lighter than before. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. Let's go, she said quietly. We've spent enough time here. As they walked back to the car, there was an unspoken understanding among them. The ghosts of the past had been acknowledged, and while the scars remained, the wounds were no longer festering. In the car, Margaret reached for Richard's hand, her touch steady and warm. Thank you, she said softly. For what? Richard asked, his voice equally gentle. For standing by me, she replied. For always standing by me. Richard smiled, his fingers tightening around hers. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. In the back seat, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his tone lighter than before. So, what now? Margaret turned to him, her smile gentle but resolute. Now, she said, we move forward. Months passed, and life seemed to find its rhythm again. The weight of the past had not disappeared entirely, but it no longer dictated their every moment. Richard and Margaret, their love rekindled and deepened, decided to take the next step in their journey together. Their wedding was a modest but heartfelt affair held in the small chapel at Sunflower Haven. Margaret walked down the aisle in a soft ivory dress, her silver hair elegantly pinned back, while Richard stood at the altar, his face a portrait of quiet joy. Daniel sat in the front row with Veronica, Grace, and Lucas, all of whom watched the ceremony with wide smiles. Linda and Jessica sat nearby, tears glistening in their eyes. James, ever the loyal friend, stood beside Richard as his best man, a broad grin on his face as he handed over the rings. When Margaret and Richard exchanged their vows, their voices were steady, but their words carried the weight of a lifetime of longing and forgiveness. I've waited for this moment for more than 50 years, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, and I promise to cherish every day we have left. Margaret's hands trembled as she held his. You've always been in my heart, Richard. I'm grateful we found our way back to each other. The ceremony concluded with applause and cheers, a celebration of love rediscovered and a future reclaimed. Later that evening, the small reception was held in the community's main hall. It was a warm and intimate gathering, filled with laughter, music, and heartfelt toasts. Grace and Lucas helped serve cake, delighting in their roles as newfound grandchildren. As the evening wound down, Richard and Margaret sat at a table with James, who had been unusually quiet during most of the festivities. Finally, as the room began to empty, James leaned closer to Richard, his expression thoughtful. Richard, he began hesitantly, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. I wasn't sure if I ever would, but after today, I think you need to know. Richard frowned, his curiosity piqued. What is it, James? James glanced at Margaret before continuing. Years ago, before I moved to Sunflower Haven, I had a strange encounter. I met William Evans. Margaret's breath hitched. My father. James nodded. Yes, he came to Florida looking for you, Richard. He asked around until he found me, and when he realized I knew you, he asked about you, how you were, what kind of life you had. Richard's brow furrowed in disbelief. Why? Why would he care? James hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. He told me he wanted to know if he'd made the right decision. I think deep down he knew he was wrong. He was tormented by what he'd done, but He didn't have the courage to face it while he was alive. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her hands covering her mouth as she processed the revelation. Richard stared at James, his mind racing. "He sought me out," Richard said finally, his voice quiet. "After all those years, he came looking for me. Why didn't you tell me before?" "I didn't know how," James admitted. "I didn't want to bring up old wounds. And honestly, I didn't know if it would matter to you after all that time." Richard leaned back, the weight of the new information settling over him. "He was a flawed man," he said after a long pause. "He made terrible decisions, and he hurt everyone around him. But maybe he was trying to make peace in his own way." Margaret reached for Richard's hand, her voice soft but firm. "Richard, he didn't fix what he broke, but we don't have to let his choices define us anymore. We've already started building something better." Richard nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're right. We've spent too much time looking back. It's time to look ahead." The days that followed were filled with quiet contentment. Daniel and his family visited often, their bonds strengthening with each shared moment. Grace and Lucas grew more comfortable around their grandparents, asking questions about their lives and sharing stories of their own. One afternoon, as Richard and Margaret strolled hand in hand through the gardens of Sunflower Haven, Richard stopped and turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Margaret," he said, his voice warm, "do you ever think about how different things could have been if we'd stayed together all those years ago?" She smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "Of course I do. But then I think about where we are now, and I realize it's not about what we lost. It's about what we've found." Richard squeezed her hand, his smile broad. "Our beginning was interrupted, but our story is far from over." She rested her head on his shoulder, her voice a gentle murmur. "And this chapter? It's my favorite one yet." As they walked on, the shadows of their past felt distant, replaced by the warmth of a future filled with love, hope, and the promise of a family united. For the first time in decades, their hearts were light, and the possibilities ahead felt endless.